So next up we have my friend David Steinrueck. David has supplied me with a really fun little bio here, and I'll share some of his biography with you. David was born on a community farm in upstate New York. What was the name of that farm?
It's a Steinrueck community, Camp Hill, Kopek, Camp Hill Village.
Soon after, he moved to southern Germany. He lived in the same town on the edges of the Black Forest that Husserl and Heidegger would take their walks through. David began contemplating the way that boundaries emerge as he overlooked the Swiss, French, and German nations from a hilltop, and eventually moved to Chicago, and apparently had a nice bowl cut, a German accent, and a weathered pair of lederhosen, which, living in Chicago, reinforced his questioning about boundaries. He began asking what it really means to be in relationship with each other and with the earth, and with ourselves, in our own consciousness. Currently, David is involved in a wood tie company. You may have seen a few people actually here wearing some wood ties. These are very cool. He's made over 50,000 of them, so that's a lot. David has studied music production in New Orleans. He was involved in the Tulane entrepreneurship program. He's a master brewer, trained in Germany. Haven't yet had a brew, but I look forward to that.
This is the next line. Turn to yoga.
He's a student teacher of yoga, and I guess recently has successfully sprouted a peanut in his garden.
Yeah. However, since writing this, squirrel got.
So please welcome David, who is going to talk about ethics and theology.
Yeah, all that stuff. So first I want to thank Ron for being here. He's my couch surfing host, and he's really embodying the empathy that how we can apply some of these things in the world. So he's been great. I have my own room, coffee, breakfast, backyard, data space. It's perfect. So as Adam pointed out yesterday, there's this gap between what we believe and what we know, or at least what we believe we know, and the actions that we take in the world, gap between these two. This is an issue that so many of us have taken up in this track that I heard all through the day yesterday. So, in this vein, this paper attempts to answer two critical questions. First, why, given what we know, do we, the human species, continue to destroy the life-sustaining systems of the Earth? And second, how can we change this? So that's really what this paper is about. Clearly, thanks to Naomi Klein, the problem is not lack of knowledge. The pollution, depletion, extinction caused by the capitalist system doesn't really need any further explanation, as Sean was pointing to. However, are human subjects really just at the whim of capitalism, saturated by ideological interpolation, cowering under the roofs, collapsing roofs as the reins of ideology pour down? No.
Could you say that again?
However, are human subjects really just at the whim of capitalism, saturated by ideological interpolation, cowering quietly under collapsing roofs as the rains of competition pour down? No, the problem is not a knowledge barrier. We know where the rains come from. We make the rains. Culture, the practice of the social order, is exactly this. Practice, not belief. Take it from Pascal, his famous statement from Fragment 233. You want to find faith and you do not know the road. Learn from those who were once bound like you and now wager all they have. They behaved just as if they did believe, taking holy water, having masses said, and so on. That will make you believe quite naturally. Even as we stand in the brown fields of drought in California, walk coughing through the streets of Shanghai, and give slime heads, goosefish, and toothfish more appealing names. Now, monkfish, orange ruffy, and Chilean sea bass. And this move has since endangered the renamed species as well, the slime heads. We continue to pump CO2 into the atmosphere and extinguish our fellow Earth species. And yet, as our hypocrisy continues, our practice continues as well. Is this not the paradox we find in the book of Job? Job, in the face of cruelty and violence inflicted upon him from the heavens, maintains his loyalty to God. Job's faithfulness is enacted rather than believed. In fact, Job does not doubt God, despite his knowledge of the conflict he sees within God himself. As described by Jung, he clearly sees that God is at odds with himself, so totally at odds, that he, Job, is quite certain of finding in God a helper and advocate against God. And just as 21st century environmentalists flounder helplessly in the trenches of conservation, struck repeatedly over the head with every new drilling permit, global trade agreement, or melting glacier, so Job is hit with one tragic injustice after another. Job has submitted to the law, perplexed and defeated by the contradictory existence of an unknowable God. The invisible hand of the market is exactly this: invisible, unknowable, beyond knowledge. It is not something we believe in, but something we do. So, given the destructive path we are on, is there not a way we can act based on duty to the earth, to each other, to respond in some way to the reality of our situation? Is not in the Kantian mode, is this not in the Kantian mode, our categorical imperative, or a la Marx, workers of the world, unite. Perhaps it is not so easy. So again, the problem might not be that we hold false beliefs, as we see with Job, even if we claim to, as Adam pointed to. Instead, as Slavoj Žižek argues, the problem might be that reality itself is distorted. And I quote, "The point is not just that we must unmask the structural mechanism which is producing the effect of subject as ideological misrecognition, but that we must at the same time fully acknowledge this misrecognition as unavoidable. Our task is not to expose the gap between subject and ideology, but rather to demonstrate the function and necessity of the gap, the barrier between subject and ideology, individual and earth, Job and God, is not epistemological, but ontological. In other words, we must realize that the radical Kantian contradiction that seems to preclude our access to the thing already, already is the thing itself. What does this mean for us? What's really at the heart of society that is able to support these paradoxes, the paradoxes of capitalism? Is, under these circumstances, as Kant famously reasons, a truly universal ethics possible? Actions that can become universal law without contradiction. When we finally get to the answer to Job, the consequences could not be any higher. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? On the cross, for the first time, God questions God. The ontological rift of the real capital R is peeled open. The unconscious, all-knowing, infinite God, upon experiencing the finitude of existence in Job, glimpses the fundamental antagonism of reality, the contradictory gap in the fabric of reality. God was made man. He has entered the world. And, glimpsing back, looking over his shoulder, he realizes his own impotence. He really was made man. It is the act of looking back, of self-reflexive positioning of the self, of God's self, that is the critical revelation. It is Hegel who is the first to make this clear. As Zizek explains, and I quote, "Sometimes we find in Hegel's work something I'm tempted to call a downward synthesis. After the two opposite positions, the third one, the Aufhebung of the two, is not a higher synthesis, bringing together what is worth maintaining in the other two, but a kind of negative synthesis, the lowest point. The Aufhebung does not unite the two, but instead completes the break, radicalizes it to such a degree that it no longer appears as a negation. It is in this way that, for example, Brown versus Board of Education, Riley versus California, new laws do not simply offer a break from the original contradictions of the law to be reunited with the best parts of the previous law. Quite the opposite. These new laws expose the fundamental weakness of the original law. Maybe the intensifying of opposites, as we were talking about yesterday, does not lead to reconciliation, but towards a true break. Or further, and I quote, "Negation of negation is nothing but repetition at its purest. In the first move, a certain gesture is accomplished and fails. Then in the second move, this gesture is simply repeated." That's depressing. The contradiction of the infinite, all-knowing God, who does not know finitude, thanks to Job, is negated through the incarnation. And subsequently, God really does die on the cross, exposed in full glory to the ontological rift, the contradictory core of the world, the capital R real. So, what happens next? If it's not the Holy Ghost that is resurrected, Aufgehoben, what is? Is it just an epistemological frame, as we were talking about before, that we can create ideology? Let's take a quick look at one of the ways that ideology functions, so I'm going to do right now, to kind of flesh this out a bit. Perhaps this can help us answer the question at the heart of our ecologically destructive behavior. And maybe it can lead us to the second question. What can we change about it? How can we change? How can we really make a difference? As revealed by Althusser, the superstructure of society, the state and ideology, although arising out of the base, has relative autonomy and can exercise a reciprocal action on the base, a move that saturates the subjects of the base through schools, churches, and family, according to Althusser. However, again, are subjects really fully taken up with the dominant ideology, be it capitalism, scientism, God, environmentalism? Clearly, if we look around us, this is not the case, which leads to two major critiques of Althusser. First, a cynical distance between the subject and the state is always maintained between subject and ideology. And in fact, what we'll find is that the cynical distance upholds the ideology, upholds the law. Just like breaking a speed limit brings the speed limit makes the speed limit real. Affairs support the institution of marriage, right? It's the cynical breaking that reinforces what is. Wearing a t-shirt is the ultimate way I can pay respect to dressing nicely. Because, I mean, it gives it relevance. You know, like, you guys are looking good compared to the second critique. Interpolation is never complete. So full like saturation of ideology. It's never complete. There's always a leftover. Something of the real, outside of the fundamental ideological fantasy, is always left over. The first move that Zizek makes is to expand Althusser's ideological institutions, marriage and schools and churches, to recognize anything in social life that is outside of the individual. Non-codified social norms recognize social rituals like handshaking, saying, "What's up? How are you doing today?" And most importantly, language. It is here that the bridge is built between ideological critique and Lacanian psychoanalytic theory. The relationship between social institutions, in the broad sense just mentioned, but again, most importantly, language, is the Lacanian symbolic order. Okay, so it's the relationship of these institutions, language is mostly what he's working on. That's a symbolic order, a system of referential signifiers. Here is the familiar argument that words are meaningless in themselves. They simply act as signifiers, placeholders, pointing towards other words. Differentiated and defined by their relationship with other words. It's what Lacan called a wall of signifiers. However, in the absence of foundation, of intrinsic identity and essential meaning, how do we find stability and order? So this is the question that Catherine Keller is wrestling with in her call to move from foundation to ground. Can, on the surface of sliding signifiers that all just refer to each other, a ground of meaning be established? A ground, as opposed to foundation, that need not simply, and I quote Keller here, that need not be simply identified with foundation and dismissed, but may divulge instead its dependency upon the prior bottomlessness. The signifier that arises as a self-referential establisher of ground is the master signifier. Establishes the ground of meaning. Everything points towards. The master signifier is ultimately empty, but creates order through subjectification of the symbolic order, the relation of the language, non-personal institutions of society. So that's the master signifier. It's empty. Why must Job obey the law of God? Because God is God. Through self-referentiality, the master signifier anchors meaning in society. The symbolic order, subjectivized by the master signifier, is what Lacan calls the big other. And so this is ideology, our society, subjectivized by a point of self-referential meaning.
So like capitalism.
Right. Could be, yeah. Exactly.
I mean, just as an example.
Yeah, that's
something
that's,
that we respond to because capitalism is capitalism.
Exactly. Yeah. The big other in this way is not an illusion of the real, but rather an escape from the real. From this bottomlessness that Keller is talking about. And I quote Hegel, the function of ideology is not to offer us a point of escape from our reality, but to offer us the social reality itself in an escape from some traumatic real kernel. in our relationship with the big other, for a moment, we're safe. However, in this process, a cynical distance is maintained. Here we come to the second critique of all concern. This ideological interpolation never fully succeeds. There's always a leftover kernel of the real. This is what he calls an objectivity. Just a confusing name, but it's this leftover bit of the real as we enter into society. This internalization of ideology by structural necessity never fully succeeds. There's always a residue, a leftover, a stain of traumatic irrationality, and a sense of sticking to it. The leftover kernel acts as both a reminder of the real and simultaneously an escape, a release valve from the imposition of society, of the big other. Okay, great. Those are a bunch of terms. What do we do with this? How does this checkmate of the real show up for us on a personal level? Given that master signifiers come and go, be it capitalism, be it any signifier that signifies a new big other that provides us with temporary safety and contributes to the flourishing of life on Earth. What's really going on here on a subjective and ethical level? Jouissance, perhaps? Jouissance, or enjoyment, is how the real, through all its different social incarnations, manifests on the personal level, at the level of the subject. If the real is taken to be both an unimaginable fullness and the destructive absolute void, jouissance, enjoyment, is both the fascinating and the terrifying, manifested in us. So here we must think of enjoyment as both to appreciate and to take, to claim. For example, if I'm looking at a bowl of granola, here's my bowl of granola, I can appreciate it in itself, enjoy how it looks, just like really enjoy it. Or I can give myself permission to take it, to enjoy it. And as I crunch down on it, I take extreme pleasure in its deliciousness and its destruction. Which leads to another translation of jouissance, orgasm. That one's in parentheses. To fully face the jouissance within yourself means complete social obliteration. Right? This is a crunching your own granola soul. Right? Full exposure to jouissance, the real, is subjective death. The fundamental ideological fantasy, therefore, acts as a mediator between individual, subject, and the social order, with the aim of keeping jouissance at a distance. The safe choice, therefore, as we see with Job, is to submit fully to the big other. I lay my hand on my mouth, proclaims Job. For, as Jung describes, he knows it is far better to withhold all mortal reflections, to say nothing of certain moral requirements. God has conceded, admitting to Job the injustice that has been done upon him. But instead of declaring that God has failed, Job remains silent. And so we find perhaps an answer to our first question. We continue our destructive patterns, rightfully so, because we are afraid. I am afraid. I'm afraid of losing myself, of facing the destructive rift of the real. I'm afraid of the loneliness at the same time, the obliterating connection to the paradoxical universe. But maybe also it's out of love of my own kind, a dedication to community, a sense of brotherhood and sisterhood. After all, who really wants to become the object of civilization's discontents? An outcast, an untouchable. So, subjects practice an ideological fantasy despite their knowledge of the contradictions within it. Or, going back to Pascal, the wager is just too high not to. However, what happens when we decide to face the full power of jouissance, of the real, of death on the cross? Is this the place of hope? Is a better resurrection possible? Are we really ready to let go of our identity, our own life story? Are we really ready to see capitalism, or reductive science, or God, or environmentalism fall? Like, right now, what would actually happen? Late in his work, Lacan shifted the goal of his practice from control to cure. In traditional psychoanalysis, ego psychology, the goal is to manage the symptom, to bring the symptom under control. Some kind of an imperfection has entered into the psyche, and the goal is to put it back in, has entered the psyche, it's damaging, it's causing disturbance. The ego begins to unravel, and the goal is to put it back in place, to restore it to sanity. The cure, on the other hand, aims to carry out the unraveling, to see it through to the end. The cure can never be carried out alone, by oneself, but instead requires an external aid, an analyst, someone to remove excuses and ego supports, to expose the contradictions at the heart of the raison. Is this not the role of Job in relation to God? Through his commitment to God in face of injustice, Job has exposed. Wow. That's funny. God to his own imperfection. Job's superiority awakens something in God, sets God into motion, into the process of unraveling. He raises himself above his earlier primitive level of consciousness by indirectly acknowledging that the man Job is morally superior to him, and that therefore he has to catch up and become human himself. There is something in Job that causes God to expose himself to jouissance, which ultimately leads to incarnation. So, how is this undertaken? This unraveling process. How do we do it? The unraveling process is predominantly a shift in perspective, not content. The shift is essentially a turn towards the leftover kernel of jouissance that we find within ourselves. A turn toward the symptom. This is a turn toward the symptom. It is through identification, through full identification with the symptom, that the subject is able to begin the unraveling process, the path towards subjective destitution. The major shift in perspective is from desire to drive. Desire, in the Lacanian sense, is the continued quest for the residual real, capital R real. Desire names the subject's perpetually frustrated quest for the leftover bit of jouissance that has been sublimated by our relationship with society. Quote, desire names the subject's perpetually frustrated quest, the leftover bit of jouissance that constitutes the fallout of the imposition of the big other. To face the real, we must turn from the goal of desire towards the process itself. Whereas the subject of desire is propelled by a perceived lack of objectivity, for the subject of drive, the quest itself immediately is objectivity. It's a turn from desire towards the quest itself. I must put down my bowl of granola, the object of my desire, and turn towards the craving itself. Why am I hungry? To be alive? But I already had some toast right before this bowl of granola. So, what's really going on here? Am I stressed? Why? And so on. This is to turn towards the actual drive itself.
You're saying from symptom to cause.
towards symptom. I don't know about cause necessarily, but towards the drive, which I guess leads this,
Not cause in a philosophical sense, but cause in a, perhaps like a medical sense, right? Like symptom, that's one sort of.
exactly, in a medical sense.
Yes.
Or, as we see in the book of Job, God is continually chasing the leftover kernel, the conscious and finite human being. Man, for God, is a small indulgence, a leftover reminder of the real, a reminder of the fundamental antagonism, the incompleteness in himself. And as we see, this desire can never be fulfilled. For when God faces conscious man, he has two options. One, retreat. Afraid, retreat to the big other, believe in God. Or two, turn towards objectivity itself, the crack in the image of God. This turn from the desire to drive and necessarily marks the beginning of the unraveling of the ego. It is in this way that with a shift towards the symptom itself is revealed to hold the answer or the question. The symptom, rather than being viewed as an outside disturbance, becomes the central key that connects the subject to the real, the wound through which true resilience is pried open. And the stakes could not be any higher. Following the wound through to the end results ultimately in subjective destitution. Is this really the best option? Would God not be better off in heaven? What can we hope to gain from this process? For Zizek, the cure, the act of facing the real, is the most authentic act. It's an opportunity to tap into the chaotic freedom of the gap of the real, an opportunity to reset. But again, this is not an act of content of exposing the core, but rather the turn towards the core. It means not just following Toto behind the emerald curtain, but taking seriously what's found there. As we see in The Wizard of Oz, even after the revelation that the wizard is none other than Oscar Diggs, a middle-aged man from Omaha, the gifts, the answers to their desires that he provides are nonetheless taken seriously. The Scarecrow is happy with his head full of brands, pins, and needles. Tin Man is happy with his silk heart stuffed with sawdust. Dorothy just wants to go home. It is only the wizard himself who performs the truly authentic act. He turns to face his wound. He gives up the throne. He must go home. Subjective destitution, the disillusion into the real, however, is only temporary. As Zizek explains, the authentic act momentarily suspends the big other, but it is simultaneously what he calls the vanishing mediator, which grounds, it brings into existence something new, a new other. The subject, as mediator, is able to unravel, but upon dissolution, arises with a new fundamental fantasy. The subject goes under, comes out with a new fundamental fantasy. For Zizek, however, the new fantasy can never be chosen. It arises from the real. It is predestined in the real. As we see in the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. Ultimately, any word could have come up. There was, after all, no consciousness, no existence, no deliberation process, only non-all, disunity, complete imperfection, out of which a break occurs. A word happens, and this word happens to be God. Subjective destitution, therefore, is an unconscious reboot, a gamble, a re-predestination, as Zizek calls it. It is in this way that we can, in fact, never intentionally create a new big other, a new alternative global community, a new sustainable civilization, a new story. Furthermore, there is no hope. Really? Is this really the case? There seems to be a missing link, the connection between subject and society. Is it not the case that the work of Plato, Aquinas, Copernicus, Marx, Austin, Carson, Mill, King, not to mention St. Paul, radically changed the dominant ideology, woke us up to the contradictions of the big other, and helped to progress society towards justice, equality, and freedom? So what's happening? Yes, indeed. For as we know, St. Paul of Tarsus, persecutor of the Christians, was not always a saint. But where Job failed, Paul succeeds. Already in the persecution of Stephen, we can see that something is bound to give. Some inherent tension is brewing. You men, and I quote, who are stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears. Right? It's like, not just here, but like, you haven't committed your heart and your ears. Are always resisting the Holy Spirit. You're doing just as your fathers did. Which one of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? They killed those who had previously announced the coming of the righteous one, whose betrayers and murderers you now have become. Stephen, in accepting the contradictions of the law, points towards it, a move that's going to lead to his death. For it seems with Saul, to become Paul, in the persecuting party, a nerve has been struck. Quote, now when they heard this, they were cut to the quick. They began gnashing their teeth at him. It is at this point, the point of teeth gnashing, that we know he's onto something. Teeth gnashing always means something. Is this not what we see with a charged response to Rupert Sheldrake's banned TED Talk, or the heated accusations of Obama's socialism in his healthcare efforts, in the violent police reaction to the Black Lives Matter protest? Something is not being acknowledged, something dangerous to the established order. But Saul, to become Paul, like Job, is not yet ready to face results. He places his hand on his mouth. His heart and his ears remain covered. It is not until later, on his way to Damascus, that he is overcome by the reality of the incarnation. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute? Saul, blinded, overcome by the real, falls to the ground, and he lays there for 3 days. Doesn't eat anything. He's just subjective destitution. Saul has faced the symptom that is plaguing society. He's faced the Christ event. And through this, he's unraveled. And it is in this way that the subjective conflict arises on the societal level. The symptom manifests in society through the event, or more specifically, as developed by Badiou and progressed by Zizek, the truth event. Truth is something that happens. It happens in a context, in a situation, in a historical site. But the evental site only ever creates the possibility of the truth event. As stated by Badiou, it is always possible that no event occur. Strictly speaking, a site is only evental insofar as retroactively qualified as such by the occurrence of the event. In other words, it's up to us to recognize and respond to truth events. The conflict and contradiction of the big other at some point breaks. It breaks through. It calls for us to respond. Paul, overcome with the significance, the truth at the core of the crucifixion event, turns towards it, embraces it, And through his subsequent actions, he brings it to the world. To do this, he must die to the law. He must undergo symbolic death. What death stands for, at its most radical, is not merely the passing, to quote Judah, what death stands for its most radical is not merely the passing of earthly life, but the Hegelian phrase, the night of the world, the self-withdrawal, absolute contraction of subjectivity, the severing of links with reality. This is the wiping the slate clean that opens the domain of the symbolic new beginning, of the emergence of a new harmony, sustained by newly emergent master signifier. All right, so for Paul, the event was rather clear, but how, today, can we recognize truth events? Can we recognize which events are really true? For Zizek, most importantly, a truth event, something that can appear in art, politics, science, love, must be universal in scope. Even when the Ferguson police chief is sitting in his office saying racist shit, even he can't be excluded from the truth event. That's why what we see on the streets is protesters aren't calling to treat a certain set of people badly. They're calling for everyone to be treated the same. That universal truth event. For this is why that Ferguson resonates. It reverberates throughout our society. And it is in Ferguson that perhaps we can also learn where to look for the event. It is those that are most excluded from the big other, from the social safety net, from the safety of joining in with the social norms, that have the least to lose from the fall of the big other. Jesus was not lounging in the executive suite, sipping cocktails, eating tapas, lacing up his Alan Edmonds. Quite the opposite. He stayed in Martha's spare bedroom. He was couch surfing. It is here that the truth events meets the least resistance, in the slums, in the ghettos, in the kitchens, in the crowded bedrooms, the enchanted graduate programs. Here, there is little safety in the dominant ideology. There's little escape from the real. So it is here that we must look for the universal truths, and pointing our bodies in this direction from our privileged positions, like Paul, with everything to lose, must unravel. So, finally, we must return to the beginning, to the destruction of the life-sustaining systems of the earth, of the diversity of species on earth. Does not, after all, the other-than-human world really have the least to lose from the collapse of the capitalist system? Is this not the ideal, or rather material, place to look for the event? Are subjects really so disconnected from the earth? Obviously not. For, is it not the case that in the same way that God on the cross looks over his shoulder, questions God, Saul on the road to Damascus looks over his shoulder and questions Saul? This surely must be the death of the subject. It is by listening to the event that a new subject is born. It is by turning towards the event itself, a gap in the fabric of ideology, the brief glimpse of the real, that a new subject arises. Paul, St. Paul, the subject of the event of Christ. Maybe for a moment we can glimpse behind Lacan's wall of signifiers. We can see that we are deeply dependent upon, and in fact becoming with, the earth. Subjective, destitute perhaps, means, as David Abram writes, owning up to being an animal, a creature of the earth, turning our animal senses to the senses of the terrain, blending our skin with the rain-rippled surface of the rivers, mingling our ears with the thunder and the thrumming frogs, and our eyes with a molten sky, feeling the polyrhythmic pulse of this place, this huge windswept body of water and stone, this vexed being in whose flesh are entangled, becoming earth, becoming animal, becoming, in this manner, fully human. For even if we cannot intentionally choose our own predestination, our new story, we can certainly know where to face, where to ask for help, and have faith that something good is trying to arise in the universe. We can turn towards Gaia, maybe. The tension within Gaia. Perhaps through all of the traumatic contradictions of the real, the impossible, irreconcilable, ontological rift of the world. Like a mother who can never fully enjoy all of her child, there is a call for love. A deep insistence in the traumatic core of the world for better worlding of the world with love. But as with the mother, whose full love in all its glory would crush, dissolve, obliterate the child, a distance is necessary. And yet, whenever possible, I call out my mom for advice. And it turns out, she usually has some pretty good answers. The end. I know we're slightly over.
Maybe one question, and then we can continue on the way over to lunch.
Thank you very much for talking. I
David?
wanted to ask you, sort of, to operationalize this, right? To really get down to like where the rubber hits the road with this.
Right.
You talked about constituencies of people who have the least to lose.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'd like to ask you, like, if you could unpack. I believe there are constituencies just outside of that ring of least to lose that have a lot to lose. Like, I'll give you an example. I have 2 children.
Yeah.
And I am constantly called to face the contradiction of needing to focus on my family's health and well-being, right? And which, in this field of political action, might mean certain things I don't do, right? So that I'm not spirited away in the night, so that I'm there for my family. That's at one end of, like, political action.
Yeah.
Things that I must sort of conform to maintain the health and well-being of my children.
Yeah.
And yet, on a longer time arc, if everyone was doing that and that only, like, there won't be an earth or air to breathe or food to eat for someone's grandchildren or great-grandchildren. So that behavior, while short-term, is preserving like something and nurturing it, is also maybe in contradiction with the long-term thing. So how do people reconcile that? Because I would argue that I have a shitload of time.
Well, I think that the point is that it's at these places, the point where people have the least to lose is a place where an eruption, like the real, has the greatest chance of breaking through, right? So if your children are really gaining a lot from you participating in the capitalist system, they're not necessarily the people who have the least to lose, right?
I think I maybe heard you say the most to lose or something like that. So I'm sorry if I screwed it up, but like.
Sorry, it's the least to lose. So if you have nothing to lose, Zizek used the example of slums or something. That's where there's a fund. They're not being acknowledged necessarily, and in fact, there's a tension between the dominant ideology and a certain subset of people fitting in. And it's in those places where.
But what about the people in the middle? That's what I want to get back to. Like, so the people who have a lot to lose.
The people in the middle can turn towards the people in the middle. I think everyone has a responsibility to turn towards the people who have the least to lose.
So,
but it may be the people in the middle who can actively. Exactly. It's a double bind. However, it may be those people that can intentionally choose that because they're not completely taken up with all the benefits of participating.
Let's leave it there for now and continue on. Thanks, David.
Thank you, guys.